Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Danube stage. Please welcome your host for this session, Roland Freudenstein.
So, hello and welcome, and can I ask our panelists to come? I'm Roland Freudenstein, Vice President of GLOBSEC and Head of GLOBSEC Brussels. And we have Rachel Rizzo, who is a Senior Fellow for Europe at the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington. Next to her, we have Samir Saran, who is the President of the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi, host of the famous Raisina Dialogue. And last but not least, Huang Yanzhong, who is Senior Fellow for Global Health, but he has strategy written all over his CV, believe me, at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. A big round of applause to our speakers. And we've been discussing Ukraine, of course. We've been discussing the Eastern Partnership. We've been discussing the region. We've been discussing several sectoral policies, transatlantic relations, security. And now we're discussing China in the context of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And I think this may well be the last panel before the well-deserved goodbye notes and, of course, the lunch at the end. But I think it's going to be one of the most interesting debates of this GLOBSEC for Bratislava Forum 2022. And I'm really looking forward to a great debate with you, with our experts, and, of course, with you, the audience. So I also would like to welcome the audience online. And you are all welcome to ask questions, and not only questions. As a moderator, it's my policy to also welcome short comments, provided that they're short. Because there's nothing that livens up a debate more than a possibly provocative comment. So please use the GLOBSEC app or Slido in order to ask your questions or make your comments. We have 60 minutes, and that should be plenty of time to get some very, very nice opinions from the experts, but also comments and questions from you. I would like to start with our experts and some kickoff questions for each one of them. And I would like to start with Huang Yanzhong, who has been talking very much about health policy at this conference so far. But I would like to ask you, well, how did Beijing, how did the Chinese government position itself exactly in the Ukraine war? And, you know, there are some people who would call it fence-sitting, and there are other people who would call it clearly siding with Russia. So maybe you can tell us how much of each component was in this policy mix. And I would like to also add a couple of quotes. Please remember that on 4th of February, at the beginning of the Beijing Olympics, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, in a joint declaration, talked about the bonds have no limits between China and Russia, and relations are much closer than during the Cold War. Well, admittedly, during the Cold War, there were some tensions sometimes. But anyway, today, this declaration sounded like two birds of a feather, I would say. And then at the same time, in the following weeks, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we had a couple of very interesting comments from the sidelines in China. And I would just like to quote two of them. On 12th of March, Hu Wei, a scholar from Shanghai, said in his essay, Possible Outcomes of the Russo-Ukrainian War and China's Choice, he said the West is going to become more powerful, China is going to be more isolated, and China should choose the lesser of two evils, side with the West. Amazing comment. And then another one, 16th of May, former Chinese ambassador to Ukraine, Gao Yushang, who said it's only a matter of time until Russia is defeated in Ukraine and China should draw the consequences from this. So, very long question. Sorry about this, but this is the context that is necessary. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Roland, for that introduction. I think in terms of the Chinese official position on the war in Ukraine, it has taken what it considered a nuanced and balanced approach. Right? On the one hand, they refused to condemn Russia's invasion. It didn't even want to call it, right, an invasion. Right? And it also blamed the NATO, right, the expansion as being the cause of the Russian invasion. In this way, it sided with some of our, the realistic scholars, that blaming the Ukrainians for triggering the Russian invasion, and China actually used that opportunity to strengthen its strategic ties with Russia, right? They call it a no-limit partnership, although later it said, well, even though we don't have any limits, right, in the partnership, there are some bottom line, red lines we have to follow, right? So, we don't know what exactly that means. But and it has indeed reinforced military ties to Russia recently, as you may have heard, right? When President Biden was visiting Japan, right? The Chinese, the strategic bombers, flew together with the Russian strategic bombers, in this joint military exercise, that sent a clear signal, right, about the close military ties with Russia. But in the meantime, it recognized that invasion as a humanitarian disaster. They refused to endorse by the Russians, by the so-called special military operations in Ukraine. And even though it has not approved officially the U.S.-led sanctions on Russia, according to Secretary Blinken, China so far has not been found to have any systematic attempts to run afoul of the sanctions. So there's a very interesting official position there. And in the meantime, if you look at the Chinese public, and including the Chinese intellectuals, I would say a majority of them would support the Russia war. And there's a very small minority, including Hui. When I was a college student in Fudan, he was already a lecturer there. That incidentally, he was a student of Wang Huning, who's now the Politburo Standing Committee member. Sometimes you wonder, when he made those remarks, seems to be not aligned with official positions. Does that mean, well, there's a difference, among, even the top echelons, on what position China should take under the war. But the public, in terms of the public opinions there, at least in the beginning stage of the war, is overwhelmingly supportive of Russia.
Thank you so much. There's lots of follow-up questions that will be asked of you later on, but I would like to continue now with our panel and ask Rachel Rizzo. Rachel, can you give us an overview of the actions, the thinking in Washington, the Biden administration's reaction, and maybe its attempts to actually influence the Chinese positioning vis-a-vis the Ukraine war? And we all remember that it's an open secret that the U.S. government actually furnished intelligence to the Chinese government before 24th of February, saying, watch what is coming. And would you please at least withdraw your support of this? And it seems like the Chinese government passed on the intelligence right away to Moscow. But Rachel, so what really happened here in Washington, and also what is the thinking in the Biden administration about this?
Well, I think when it comes to how the Biden administration is thinking about China's say, lessons learned from the Ukraine war, you have to take a few steps out and look at this as a much broader picture. And that picture is that it's important to remember that the idea, the vision that underpins Biden's foreign policy worldview is this existential struggle between democracies and autocracies. You hear him use that framework over and over again in many of his speeches, right? This was one of the opening speeches that he gave to a joint session of Congress just maybe a month after he took office last year. And this isn't just a goal of making sure that democracies deliver for the people and work for the people within them, but it's to make sure that the institutions and organizations that democracies both create and work within are attractive enough and work well enough to pull maybe non-aligned countries towards the West instead of, for example, towards China. So when you look at Biden's approach towards China more broadly, it really is a continuation of Trump's strategy, ... but with allies. So continuing this tough approach to China, but not doing it through the lens of America first, but doing it in concert with our allies and partners across the globe. So you look at Biden's continuation of Trump-era tariffs. You look at the executive order that Biden signed last year prohibiting Americans from investing in, I think it was 59 Chinese companies that have ties to the Chinese military. Blinken gave a major China speech just last week at George Washington University. There was an announcement this week to continue trade talks with Taiwan. And then Biden, of course, just made his first trip to the Indo-Pacific region where they announced this Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is unfortunately not really a trade deal, but opens up cooperation on things like trade and supply chain, kleptocracy and corruption and other things. I think it's also important to look at the language that the Biden administration uses when it comes to China. They don't use the word cooperate, they use the word collaborate, and that's very intentional. It's good to remember that we have midterm elections coming up in November, and so there's not a lot of room for the Biden administration to move too much on China policy. And really, there's not that much that he could do at this point that would make his administration, I think, more attractive or less dangerous as some right-wing folks in the United States might see it. And so I think the reaction to how the United States has approached China in terms of the Ukraine crisis is just a continuation of this much broader strategy.
And we all remember Henry Kissinger's famous strategy of the 1970s to actually overcome the tension and the antagonism between the US and China in order to mobilize China against the Soviet Union, which was considered historically successful. And then in the last couple of years, just remind you of French President Emmanuel Macron, who quite openly advocated doing what I would call the reverse Kissinger, which is to, somehow overcome the tension with Putin's Russia, despite Putin, or at least signal that with some future Russia, we want to have very good relations in order to somehow break the Sino-Russian alliance and pry Russia away from China. And then we have, and this was by some experts and pundits and even politicians in Europe and the US proposed very clearly over the last couple of months, we have this idea of doing the reverse Kissinger. In other words, now going back to trying to make China an offer that they cannot refuse. In trying to get more support for the Western position on Russia's war in Ukraine, and of course less support for Putin. So, Rachel, can you just give me a short analysis of these ideas and how powerful do you think they are?
Well, that's a really good question. I think in the United States, it's a little bit fanciful to think that we are going to approach China and somehow convince them to maybe not tacitly support Russia, but completely turn away from it. That's basically saying, hey, can you help us defeat Russia so that we can turn our attention to you? I don't think that's very realistic. I will say it's been interesting in Washington to see sort of different camps emerge in terms of policymakers and foreign policy thinkers, where the war in Ukraine has basically awoken this sort of classic transatlanticist wing of the foreign policy establishment, which is a group of people that have said, look, we told you so, we've been telling you so. This rebalance in the Indo-Pacific region has made us weaker in Europe, has made Europe more subject to Russian influence or Russian invasion. And so this means that the United States needs to not only redouble our commitment to Europe, but maybe send permanent troops to the eastern flank, or at least increase our rotational troop presence. And then you have sort of this other wing that is saying, now wait a minute, we have written numerous times, especially in the National Defense Strategy, that China is the pacing threat. The Indo-Pacific region is the region that we have to focus on, and we cannot let the Russian invasion of Ukraine distract us. They might be a spoiler, but they are not the major long-term strategic challenge that China is, and that is the region that we need to focus on. So it's been interesting to see sort of how these two camps of people have been playing off each other.
Thank you so much for this insight. And I would like, before we come to audience questions, I would just like to ask Samir Saran about a couple of more questions about China. First of all, the future of the China-Russia relationship. I mean, what's ahead of us there? Do you see any change in the current position, or will we see the very strong incentive for the Chinese leadership to let's say, run away with the spoils, having Russia much weaker and much more dependent on China, and at the same time not wanting to lose face in trying to fundamentally change the position? I mean, where do you see things going?
So my take is going to be slightly different on this subject. First of all, I don't think that the Chinese necessarily see this as a moment of great reflection, or even in fact of resetting some of their approaches. In fact, I would argue that the Russian actions may have been emboldened by the Chinese successes in the past few years. Fait accompli in the South China Sea, disregard to the order of the Hague Tribunal, carving boundaries in other parts of the world, aggression against India, sanctions against European MEPs. I think the Chinese template is something that the Russians are trying to perhaps adopt. Russians having forgotten that China is $13 trillion and they're only $1.5 trillion. So I think, first of all, we must see this as a moment when it is the Russians who have tried to ape the Chinese model of dealing with the world, and it's not China who is watching and learning or reflecting on this current development. So it is our collective inability to respond to Chinese adventurism in the last 5 years that has emboldened Putin to do what he did. And I think it is a collective failure of all of us to push back against Pax Seneca and Beijing's world that has allowed this to happen. Now, having said this, I think they are not necessarily in a space where they are having to balance things. I think they are pretty much, if the world was a casino, China is the house, and the house wins. And in today's particular geopolitical landscape, either ways, I mean, a weaker Russia works for China. A Russia that comes out of this looking reasonably decent also works for China. And I don't think Chinese see any downside to this. Nor are Chinese going to be worrying about the European response to the Russians here. I don't think the Europeans have scared the Chinese with what they've been able to do. I mean, Europeans have done a collective gymnastics to allow the purchase of gas and oil from Russia. That's what the Chinese have seen. That if you have some core supply chain control, everyone will come to the table. And that's the lesson coming out of Ukraine. It is not of pessimism or defeat. So the Chinese are not necessarily either bothered by what Russia did or the response to Russia. And that places countries such as ours in a terrible space, because we are, in some sense, the front line in many ways to their political designs, to their, I mean, we share a thousands of kilometer long boundary. We had a clash 2 years ago. We still have 100,000 troops on the mountains facing off. And that is something that Indian planners are therefore having to think of. Now, the worst nightmare for us would be a weakened Russia, completely beholden to China. Now, that would be terrible. And Russia having no recourse other than China, both for its markets and for its political and economic resources, would be a nightmare. And in some sense, I don't believe that it would terribly alter the situation, but political thinkers tend to exaggerate that particular happening, and therefore you see a little bit of a reticence in some parts for that particular eventuality. But I think Europe should also be thinking about the same question. What works for Europe? A Russia that is a B team of China, or a Russia that is reasonably stable and comes out as a stronger actor in this part of the world? I think that's a question we all need to think about.
I mean, this really, thank you for this exhaustive answer. That really begs the question, is the Indian government still with the reverse Kissinger strategy here? Seriously?
Reverse Kissinger, we always, listen, I think our relationship with Russia predates any Kissinger strategy. So I think Kissinger may have learned from our relationship and may have applied it to Wu China. So I think to answer your question in a brief manner, no. I don't think we are considering anything other than two simple factors. One, how do we continue to do things in the interest of our people? Number two, how do we ensure that we are able to continue to work with partners, including in the West, to resolve this particular crisis, conflict, war that is unfolding in Europe? And I think they are caught between these two big questions. Sometimes they are contradictory, the steps you need to take. And that plays out, and I think that is basically what is expressing itself.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have a couple of interesting questions already here on Slido. I would like to, yes, you're also welcome to raise your hands, but give me some 10 minutes maybe to deal with the questions I already have, and then we come to direct questions from the audience. Giga Turk, are you here? Would you like to ask your question? Can you give the microphone to this gentleman here?
Giga Turk from Slovenia. I'm reading, the Chinese English version of what you would have as Economist or Time or Newsweek. And there was a very interesting article. There was a round anniversary of Nixon's trip to China. And what the Chinese authors very much pushed forward was this wisdom at the time. There was even, I think, a quote either from Mao or from Kissinger saying, well, we have totally different systems, but we can cooperate. If you frame the global struggle as a struggle between democracies and autocracies, it somehow implies that democracies would like to change the internal system of autocracies to be more like us. And that, of course, invites the kind of defensive position in those countries. And I'm wondering, why not return to the good old European Westphalian principles? Let have each country their own religion and their own way of organizing themselves, and let's try to work the international peace around these lines.
I could see Samir nodding slightly, but I want to give the floor to Rachel, because I think most of all this is for you, and then our other colleagues can chime in. Rachel.
Sure. So yes, I agree with you that the framing of autocracies versus democracies can be pretty zero-sum. And I don't think that's necessarily helpful. I think a better way to frame it would be strengthening democratic institutions and not framing it as an us versus them or democracy versus autocracy. So when you look at Janet Yellen, for example, recently has talked a lot about reforming Bretton Woods institutions, looking at strengthening NATO, for example, strengthening the European Union, strengthening different Western institutions so that they are not only more attractive to the countries that comprise them, but like I said before, more attractive to countries that might have a decision to either turn west or turn east, and that's what I think it comes down to. I also think it's really important when we have these discussions about reforming institutions that we include discussions with non-aligned countries, because I think over the last 20 years, while the United States has been fighting wars of choice in the Middle East, it's been a really good opportunity for countries like Russia and China to make pretty good friends with countries that would have been very helpful for us in the current situation, and that's our mistake.
Samir?
I'm comfortable with the framing, autocracies versus democracies, provided the club of democracies deliver. And I don't think they are. If you look at the countries that are part of the group that is sanctioning Russia today, and go back 1 year, and look at the countries who were vaccinated first, they would be similar. Now you're expecting those who you left to their own during the worst period in their lives, when the pandemic was upon them, the club of democracies didn't nearly serve them. So, democracies versus autocracies work when democracies deliver to other democracies, and they have failed to deliver. And the last 2 years, Afghanistan, happenings in Asia, allowing folks to change the political map of the world, tells you that the club of democracies is on feeble ground. Yes, we must strengthen it, and I'm comfortable with that framing, provided we get our act together.
Well, I totally agree with that. This is the principle, right? The seeking common grounds, and allow the differences, to be present. That's what I believe Zhou Enlai, the former Chinese premier, said. That it's China certainly would like that idea, but in the meantime, when we talk about how the ideology became such a dividing factor here, is that certainly the United States this is how perception matter, right? U.S. perceived China as a threat of the rules-based international order, which happened to be also liberal international order, right? And for China, as President Biden has pointed out, it also tried to portray what this relationship, right, as an ideological competition, right, between the United States and China, right? According to President Biden, right, basically President Xi told him, that there's no future for democracy, right? Because democracy requires consensus, but in a rapidly changing world, right, the autocracies will do a better job, So it's not just that the U.S. try to ideologize, insult this ideological divide here. I think China also contribute to that divide in this way.
Excellent point. I was actually going in the same direction. I may abuse of my moderator's rights here a little bit by also answering Giga's point. Look, I would fully agree with Huang Yanzhong that it wasn't the West that picked this fight. If there is a Cold War 2.0, let's go back to the mysteriously sounding document number 9 in 2013. And please, this was a Chinese Communist Party document, which defined the West as the total enemy, not because of what the West does, but for what the West is, for constitutionalism, free media, freedom of opinion, freedom of association, and checks and balances. These were defined as the mortal enemies of China at a time when the West was still completely on this, as we know today, illusion that we could actually come to a very constructive relationship with China and build the world together with China. And so, we didn't start the fire. That's one. The other point, I think, that is important to make here is, it's not about democracy export. It's not about throwing a political system on people that don't want it. It is about supporting Democrats. I would like to talk about the global solidarity of Democrats, not democracy promotion or democracy export. And the global solidarity of Democrats is very simply, if a young person from Hong Kong asks me, "You live in a free country, I don't, can you help me?" The last thing I will say is, "No, I can't." It doesn't have to be the 82nd Airborne Division descending over Beijing or something. But it could be a Fulbright scholarship or one of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, for example. But this global solidarity of Democrats, I think, is absolutely essential, and we should not confuse it with the alleged moral imperialism that the West is being accused of. So, then I would like to come to, actually, Charles Tannock. You had a very interesting question. Can anything change the Indian government's attitude about the war in Ukraine, about the question of, somehow appeasing Russia? Charles, are you here in the room? Right. Can he get the microphone?
Yeah, I'm a very long-standing friend of India. In fact, I founded the Friends of India in the European Parliament 20 years ago. So I have been disappointed that India is a mature democracy which upholds international law, but it's refused to get off the fence and condemn naked aggression against a sovereign state, which is actually committing effectively a form of genocide against Ukraine. So I would appeal to the Indian government to speak as a democratic nation, it is the largest democracy in the world. And my other question, which I will take this opportunity to ask very quickly, BRICS, it's a word we hardly hear these days. It's interesting, they've all stuck together on the issue of Russian aggression. India, China, Brazil, South Africa. Is BRICS something meaningful again, and will it expand to another country? Which one will that be?
Samir?
I think his one question is to the Indian government, the other is to the Chinese government, which is the presidency of the BRICS this year. But I think BRICS will certainly face difficulties in evolving as a group. This was mentioned by an official Indian statement, in fact, by the Foreign Minister of India who spoke yesterday. So I don't really want to go into that subject. He has already responded to that. But in the BRICS forum, he has mentioned that 2 out of the 5 have violated sovereignty of other countries. And of course, he was referring to Russia and China here. And therefore, one of the key cornerstones of BRICS, which was respecting sovereignty, have already been violated. Now, I think BRICS is going to have to really come up with some miraculous evolution for it to continue to grow. It may be able to attract others who may not be on the right side of history, or maybe they might be on the right side of history. They may be able to attract them, but I think it will certainly go through a period of turbulence in the discussions. On the question of the Indian position, I think as a parliament, as a friend of India, you have access to those on power. Let me just give you a different take. When the Americans invaded Iraq, a decade and a half ago, even earlier, the Indian government had similarly tried to abstain, and there was this big furor in Parliament across party lines. And they were forced to issue a statement condemning American aggression. Big parliamentary debates happened. There was furor in the streets, newspaper articles, headlines. That is missing this time. So we need to ask ourselves that why is it that a polity that is so divided, a political system that is so polarized, any government decision that is questioned and in some sense challenged all the time, this one was not. And I think this is the question that we need to think about. And it is not being disappointed with India. It is equally about perhaps not even engaging with India, and therefore not knowing why is it that there was such a widespread support for abstention. By the way, it is not support for Russia. I disagree with that. I think there is a clear distinction between our statement and our voting. Our voting abstained, but our statements were quite aggressive and harsh. In fact, there is a clear distinction between what we said and how we voted vis-a-vis China. So I don't think we were supporting Russia in any case, and we are not. And I don't think anyone in the largest part of the Indian public space is. However, I do not see the same uproar against abstention, which tells you a story. It tells you a story even about our relationships, and we need to think about it.
Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought on this question. I would like to continue with some spontaneous questions from the audience. We have a lady right here in the first row. Would you please briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question or make a comment?
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the space. I'm Eugenia Joni, the president of Youth Atlantic Treaty Association, and I will take this occasion to make a question to Rachel. I know that you can have both hats, expert of NATO. So you mentioned a lot Biden's administration and the U.S. position towards their consideration on China. Taking account that we are just 3 weeks ahead to NATO Madrid summit, in your opinion, will there be a change of narrative or a change in the position that China will have towards NATO and the whole alliance? So thank you very much.
Rachel?
Sure. So, as we all know, major NATO summit coming up at the end of June. Not only are we going to be talking about the accession of Finland and Sweden into the alliance, but NATO is going to be releasing its new strategic concept, which is basically the vision that guides the alliance over the next 10 years. And as we all know, the last strategic concept was released back in 2010. It's woefully out of date. The word China isn't mentioned a single time in that one. And so over the last 6 or 7 months or so, as the conversations on what the next strategic concept will look like, those conversations have focused heavily on how China might be represented and how the alliance will be thinking about China. But I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has done a couple things. First of all, it's focused NATO in a way that it hasn't been focused for a long time. I think since, well, I would say maybe around 2001, the alliance has sort of drifted a little bit, struggling to find a real purpose. It has found those purposes, but what it stands for, I think, as a military alliance or an alliance of countries with similar political views and democratic tendencies, I think what this invasion has done is focus NATO again on its eastern periphery. But what I think it's important to remember is that the strategic concept is not meant to last a week. It's not meant to last a month. It's meant to last for the next 10 years. And so while there might be a situation where this concept focuses more on Russia than we might have anticipated, I think China will still be present there given the fact that it is going to be a strategic challenge over the next decade. And as Jens Stoltenberg has said numerous times, NATO talking about China is not trying to push NATO into the Indo-Pacific region. It's a reaction to China's inroads into Europe technologically, economically, politically. And so I do think that the new strategic concept will still talk about China in a way, although we'll have to wait and see what it actually says next month.
But we're still with challenge, not a threat, right?
Yeah.
In NATO language.
Yeah.
Okay, there are 2 more from this part of the audience. The gentleman in the middle of the second row, Konstantin von Eggert. Give him the mic. Right here.
Yes, good afternoon, Konstantin Eggert from Vilnius. I have 2 questions actually, one to Samir and one to Yanzhong. One to Samir is, essentially, how I read the Indian abstention is that, to quote George Orwell, some animals are more equal than the other in the eyes of the Indian government, not in yours, of course. So essentially, does it mean that Indian government thinks that Russia is entitled to a sphere of influence in the, say, post-Soviet space in which it can do whatever it wants, including destroying sovereignty of other recognized states? If so, how does it help India? And to Yanzhong, take us through the way you think the Chinese government is now looking at its designs on Taiwan in the wake of Putin's aggression against Ukraine and Western, American, European, so on, response to it. Does it encourage Beijing, or does it make it think twice? Thank you.
Go ahead, please. Oh,
So
Huang.
I think you are correct. Some animals are more equal than others, but that was not necessarily an Eastern statement. That was pretty much from this part of the world. And so has the politics been. So I could toss it back and say that, does Europe believe that some animals are more equal than others? And hence it's okay when you act in a certain way in Asia and you expect a different performance in Europe. And since Orwell comes from this particular part of the world, I could understand your urge to characterize the world in that manner. But having said that, I think the second part of your question is more real. And the spheres of influence and Russia's role, or anyone's role in this world. And I think there is this big debate over the past 10 to 15 years. I think Rachel alluded to it when she mentioned the US with others as a coalition. I think multipolarity in one way or another is something that most of us are beginning to engage with. The concept that there will be power centers, that there will be regional actors, there will be, therefore, geographies where certain countries would have to play a more important political as well as economic role, is certainly true. And it was not India that appointed Russia as the second, USSR as the second pole, or Russia thereafter as part of its Eurasian avatar. Russia has a role, period. Now, is it a role that is diminishing? Is it a role that is going to be sustainable? Is it a role that is going to be constructive? These are all valid questions. And the answer to all three of them, in my view, sitting today, is a negative. So Russia, unless it changes its act dramatically, drastically, and rethinks its role, it is going to continue to be someone with muscles and without any offerings for or any relevant contributions to either the region or the world. And this is something that is apparent to all of us, right? So yes, multipolarity is upon us. And therefore, when we start assessing global actions, global outcomes, positions countries take, it should not be from a unipolar lens. That period is gone. And I think that is something that many of us have to get accustomed to. That we all have the many of us have the ability to do great damage. Very few have the ability to do great good. And for that, collaborations and partnerships are important. And therefore, Biden, which has a Trump policy without the tweets and with allies, is a good policy coming out of the US. But all of us will also have to create new partnerships. And for that, empathy is a good word to use.
Thanks very much.
Well, I think what is happening in Ukraine certainly was a litmus test, right? That will, I think, could embolden China to take over Taiwan, but also could deter China from, taking military actions on the island. It all depends on the progress, of the war, right? Whether Russia is going to be able to take over, Kyiv, for example. And the Western response, right? How strong the Western response is, right? So if, right, there is, despite the heavy cost, that Russia is able to achieve, the victory on the military battlefield, and the West countries, fail to mount, a unified, strong response. I mean, by sending troops, right, to Ukraine, right? They might think, right, that, if we choose to invade Taiwan, then you don't expect the U.S. to intervene directly. They might provide weapons, but at least they don't send troops there. So with our overwhelming military capabilities, we can still take over Taiwan. So that might send actually strong incentives, right, for China to have a future propel, right? They actually, maybe in the not so near future, a military intervention. But if, right, Russia is defeated, not just strategically, but also on the battlefield, right? If the West, right, is able to mount very strong and effective coalition against the invasion, I think that is going to send a very strong signal to deter China from take over Taiwan. So China is certainly watching, paying close attention to what is happening now in Ukraine.
Rachel, you want to come in here?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot in the United States about the lessons that China is learning from the invasion of Ukraine, and I think it's important not to overestimate those lessons, but to look closely at what China is watching. And I think that you mentioned this on the strength of Western response. I think that has probably been pretty surprising, although I don't have insight into Xi's brain, probably pretty surprising to Xi and the CCP. But I think there are a couple other things to look closely at. I think China understands that its power and its growth is predicated on its integration into the global economic system, which means that it needs to be able to insulate itself from future sanctions should they appear. And that means that it sort of takes this dual circulation policy where it encourages exports, but it's also working on becoming more self-sufficient to be able to shadow itself from sanctions should it ever become necessary. I think it's also looking at the way that Putin has used nuclear saber rattling to his advantage in the Ukraine crisis. That's basically been a scenario where just the threat of the use of nuclear weapons has been able to deter future U.S. Not influence, but integration into this into the war in Ukraine, and I think it probably underscores China's goal of modernizing its nuclear weapons. So those are just a couple things I think to look at.
Just a quick word.
Very quick.
I think if you are a betting person, you would be betting on thousands of Chinese currently knocking heads, finding ways to bypass the SWIFT. I think that's something that they are going to be working on. That would be their obsession. Internationalizing their currency and bypassing SWIFT. Nothing else that Europe has done is going to tickle them. It's all very good. Solidarity, transatlantic euphoria about being one again, conferences, and no. Nothing that you have done on the ground against a $1.5 trillion economy is going to even tickle them. They know that one thing that the prize jewel, which is gas and oil, you have not been able to disturb. Chinese has a whole treasury of those prize jewels. They control so many supply chains that they know that it will be impossible for a coalition to emerge. We have seen, in fact, on the other hand, Europe over the last 5 years, US over the last many years, bending over backward to allow trade to continue, even as politics was going downhill. And that is the lesson they have taken. Again, let me go back to my original point. It is the Chinese template that Putin is copying. China is not learning from Putin. Putin has tried to do the China on them without having the heft and the muscle. That is what has happened.
Thank you so much. We have to be really, really brief. I've got 5 people on the list. Let's take them in a row, and we'll start here on the very extreme left, at least geographically. Over here, microphone goes to the gentleman in the last row on the left. Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark Clemens from Slovakia. I just have a real quick question, a personal question to all of you. Basically, in the first days of the Russian invasion to Ukraine, we have seen, and people were nervous about the possible invasion also to China's to Taiwan, and because they can open, for example, a second front. What are your thoughts about this? What were your first thoughts when you heard about this in the first days? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we continue with a question with all the way in the back in the corner there. The lady.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank
Belina,
you very much.
of
Thank
course.
you. Yes.
Now I see you.
I need to ask a question. A very short question, no remarks because of time. Rachel, we also have the strategic compass, which was adopted and launched in March, and we have moved beyond, identifying China or Russia as a challenge. And I suppose that there should be a serious and honest discussion about a threat multiplier, China plus Russia. I want to hear your comment on that. And I have a question for Samir and also for the Chinese colleague on potential risk of a military tension between India and China ahead of the Congress of the Communist Party. How do you assess a potential risk of a military tension between China and India in this year?
Very pertinent questions. Thanks, Velina. And gentleman in the middle here.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Rabina. I'm here with the young leaders. My question is to all of you. I thank you for opening the floor for multipolarity discussion, and I personally research grand strategies in conditions of multipolar systems. So first question for Rachel: how do you evaluate the U.S. pivot to Asia in terms of retrenchment? I know there's a lot of debate on this in Washington recently. How do you think what's your thinking in Washington on containing two opponents at the same time, or is there any degree to this, to this retrenchment? I know it's a follow-up question after these two questions. And to gentlemen, please, maybe your thoughts on strategies for survival in multipolar systems and avoiding the diets, even though in terms of great power competition. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And then we had a question right here in the first row. The gentleman from Spain, I believe.
Thank you. My name is Diego López Garrido. I'm the executive vice president of a Spanish think tank called Alternativas Foundation. I have two brief questions to the panelists. First, following the last questions, you think that we're going to have in the future a new international order similar to the Cold War? Second question, I think there is a difference between the positions adopted by the European Union and the United States in relation with China. Now, after the Ukraine war, the West is united. But in relation with China, I think that Biden defined China as a systemic rival. It's different from the European position. I think that Europe doesn't define China as a systemic rival. China is far from Europe. Then I'd like to know your opinion about this. Could be a difference between the position of Europe and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to top it off in this round, there's another interesting question on Slido from Ivana Karashkova. Are you in the room? She's not here, but I can ask it for her. So she's asking, Borrell dubbed the last EU-China summit focusing on Russian invasion to Ukraine as the dialogue of the deaf. Now, if China wants to unfreeze its relations with the EU, what would China, Beijing, have to do? And I hope you remembered more or less the questions, but I'm not asking you to respond to every single point. So be selective, take maybe 2 points each, and we start with Huang Yanzhong.
Well, thank you. I start with the last question here. What should Beijing do, right? Because in that dialogue, right, that's with Europe, it was it's a disaster, essentially, right? That just, I think for Beijing, while they were highlighting by its own, by the national interest, the core interest, that is Taiwan, and Xinjiang. But in the meantime, you should also, right, consider Europe's, right, their interests, right, their concerns, right, that is how the Russian invasion of Ukraine posed, such a threat to the international security, right? So, that is something I think Beijing could have done better, but instead of the threatening, sanctioning a country like the small country of Lithuania, right, and then pressing other European countries, to rule out the country from the supply chain. That's only to strengthen this alliance against China. It's not going to do. It's going to be counterproductive. And secondly, this prospect of a Cold War with China, right? You might recall that Secretary Blinken in his recent speech that they don't want to have a Cold War with China. Right? They don't want to, actually, the U.S. doesn't want to seek change China. Well, in part, this is because they realize its limitations of the U.S. capabilities, the limits, right? So now they're trying to focus on basically shaping the strategic environment, right, of China, right, to hopefully that is going to change China's behavior, change China's policy. But that certainly whether this is going to work is a question. And third is about this potential China, Sino-India border conflict. And I think if you consider, right, that the China's handling of the Russia, the crisis in Ukraine, failure, right? Its handling of its economy, failure, right? Its handling of the COVID, failure, right? So, this causing unprecedented crises for China. Potentially that could lead to a legitimacy crisis. So in that situation, as I argued in the recent Foreign Affairs article, potentially they might lead countries to rely on nationalist adventurers to divert domestic tensions. So even before, especially before the 20th Party Congress in the fall. So that makes that disputes, terror disputes, a conflict with India likely.
Samir, Saran.
I'm worried now. But he may be right. I think the idea that Putin is insane and Xi is a rational actor, I think has not been tested, and it's overstated in Western media. I think many of us need to start thinking about Xi as an irrational actor as well. Not because he believes he's irrational, because he doesn't fit into our frameworks of rationality. And therefore, I think Xi is seeking to become emperor for life this autumn, early winters, could eventually believe that taking risks might be in his favor. Now, I think there are two issues here. One is that we all know China is going to do things, but China is the grey rhino phenomena. We see the rhino charging, and yet we are unable to do anything about it. We know that China is going to do something on Taiwan. We will continue to have conferences that will discuss what we should do when it does it. We know it is going to attack its neighbors, and we continue to discuss the response rather than respond to it. And I think China is because of its sheer size, it has the grey rhino momentum. It is upon us before we are able to respond. I think be it Taiwan, be it South China Sea, be it the Himalayan borders, China is a likely aggressor, and we have to start thinking about preparing for that aggression. And I think that responds to the Taiwan question also that my friend had asked from that side of the room. On survival strategies, I think a new international order is important, and it is already upon us. We have not been writing it. Someone else has been. I think it is time that we first stop defending the incumbent order because it is not working. We understand that it has lived its utility, it served us well, but it is time to invest in a new project, new partnerships, and new formats. I think we will have to perhaps look at plurilateralism, small groups initially, make it attractive, promote those, bring larger people into the tent, and create a system that can prevent extreme actors from taking liberties. We will have to first create the fence where we will protect the kingdom, the liberal order. But currently, I think it's a fair game. Anyone is playing with it. And the survival strategy has to be to invest in the building blocks of the new system? Could it be, could this moment, the new EU-US solidarity, or rather the re-engagement with Taschen be that moment? Could Quad be one of the initial signs of a new order in that part of the world? But I think we will have to look at these smaller groups because the world has become too bulky to manage too many political agendas through any unified framework. So yes, I think that's the survival strategy.
Thanks very much. Rachel, over to you.
Sure. So these are all really interesting questions. I'll start with the strategic compass. This was, a document that came out a couple months ago, and it sort of paints a vision for the European Union, looking at it as an economic player, a security player, deepening partnerships around the globe. I haven't read it closely enough to know if it talks about Russia-China cooperation, but I do think the EU-China policy is a really interesting issue to discuss, because I don't think that we're ever going to be in a scenario where we have total EU unity on how the continent should approach China. But I think we are seeing increased pressure coming from specific states. Just this week, we saw the EU-Taiwan trade and investment dialogue, which is focused heavily, as you would imagine, on semiconductors, export control, investment screening, and the like. The EU is pushing Taiwan to decrease its outbound investments to China. China is not happy about any of this, as you can imagine. And I think in general, the bloc might be loosening its stance on Taiwan a bit after Lithuania opened a Taiwan trade office in Vilnius and found itself in the crosshairs of a China trade spat. You saw statements come out of institutions around the EU saying that certain states could decide to pursue their own policy with Taiwan if they chose. And that's a big step. That's not something that has been discussed in that way in the past. But so I think the EU needs to get the high-level stuff right, things like tech regulations, things like figuring out ways to support countries like Lithuania that find themselves on the receiving end of Chinese economic backlash. I don't think it did a great job of that. It could do better. In terms of the US pivot to Asia, I think the US response to Ukraine has been strong, and we've been a leader and able to create unity around multiple rounds of sanctions and sending military aid and foreign aid to Ukraine. But I think that we need to be honest with ourselves about where the United States strategic focus is heading, and that is towards the Indo-Pacific region. When you look at someone like Jake Sullivan, or when you hire someone like Kurt Campbell, who is a major player in this space as the Indo-Pacific coordinator in the White House, that goes to show just how seriously this administration is taking China as the pacing threat and the region as the pacing strategic challenge. So while the United States has been able to pivot a little bit back to focus on Russia, I think we need to be pretty honest about the fact that our long-term focus will be continuing to focus on the Indo-Pacific, and we're not going to see a scenario where we need to figure out a way to provide equal resources to both theaters.
Which brings us to the end, and I won't let you go for two reasons. One, my famous takeaways at the end. Don't leave home without it. And the second one is, of course, please all stay put for the final remarks, the closing of the conference by Robert Vass in a couple of minutes. Now, takeaways. Three things. First of all, back to the initial question. I mean, is China rather sitting on the fence, or is it rather siding with Russia? Well, the answer is the Facebook one. It's complicated. Obviously, the Chinese leadership doesn't like what's happening in Ukraine, sees some advantages in this situation by Russia getting weaker, but also some people in China clearly see the risk of the West being more united, and this in the long run being actually not so great for China. And yet, and this is my second point, a radical change in the Chinese position is not really on the horizon. So the attempts to pry China away from Russia give the Beijing government some kind of incentive to condemn Russia, or at least make some visual signs of distancing. All this doesn't seem to be realistic, for the very simple reason that China and Russia do have a common existential enemy, and that is the West, and that is, coming back to my answer to Gigaturk, it's not because of what the West does, it's because of what the West is. You know, whether we're going to have a new Cold War or not, there are certain automatisms in the systemic rivalry which are not easy, which will not easily disappear. And the final point, I really liked in this debate and also in previous ones, this interchange between the Global South and Central Europe. And I think both sides have lessons to take away from this. Central Europe, the staunchly Atlanticist of this region and of NATO and so on, need to understand that there are factually other ways to look at the Russian invasion in Ukraine than ours. That's a fact. We need to take note of this. How morally justified these differences are, this different viewpoint is another question. And I think from the Global South's perspective, it might be worthwhile seeing that some elements that sound like whataboutism, you know, what about what the West did in this or that situation, is not the right way to address this region. I mean, this country, Slovakia, has never colonized anyone. Actually, it's been, in a way, maybe in a benign way, it's rather been a colony of someone else. And, you know, so a lot of the rhetoric that we hear, which is justified from a place like Delhi, falls on, I would say, not exactly on fertile ground in this region. And so there is a lot of mutual understanding, I think, necessary between the staunchly Atlanticist attitudes here in Central Europe and the Global South. And that's what conferences like the GLOBSEC Bratislava Forum are exactly for. Now, I would like to ask you to give a big hand of applause to our panel, our specialists. And of course, we also appreciated your comments, your opinions, your questions. Please stay put. And I will now like to ask Robert Vass to do the final remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roland. Thank you for the panelists, and thank you for all the participants who were with us for the last 3 days. I think this year's GLOBSEC was really exciting because we've been able to mingle around without masks, in person, not through Zooms, and feel the power, feel the emotions that were around our debates. And I felt a lot of emotions, not only coming from Ukrainians, and that I felt was so strong, but also emotions of all of us that we must win this war. Ukrainians must win this, and we need to help them. That's the clear message from this conference. And I think there is an unprecedented unity in the West and a clear resolution to help Ukraine. But we need to do everything possible that this unity will last not only for months, but for years to come. This is also the mission of GLOBSEC, mission of Central European leadership in the world, because what we see is that this war has not only impact on the region, on Ukrainians, it has a global impact in food insecurity, energy prices, inflation, slowing down of world economy. We can see how a conflict in one part of the world can shake up all the security system globally. So we need to do everything possible that this war ends as soon as possible and that Ukrainians win. And there is a clear message to dictators and autocrats that it's not a cheap endeavor for them. But we cannot forget also other partners and other countries, like in the Balkans. We had a lot of prime ministers from Georgia, Moldova, and presidents and the Balkans. We need to make sure that the same scenario that happened in Ukraine will not happen in other countries. So we need to strengthen our own resilience at home, and we need to help them to make sure that we go out of this crisis stronger than ever. So the unity, this is the key word that I'm taking out from this. And also, I think through this emotion we felt clearly, and I felt it when President Zelensky was speaking, when Prime Minister Šmihal and others. They are Europe. They are part of the Europe. Emotionally, historically, but they need to be part of Europe also institutionally. It is our obligation to give them the political chance to be part of the European Union, to give them the candidacy status. And then they need to fulfill all the criteria. But we cannot send a signal to Russians that this is kind of a gray zone and we don't really know what to do with it. It needs to be a clear signal that they belong to us and we belong to them. So this is very important. So over the last 3 days, we had a lot of discussions, not only in this room and on 3 stages. In Maria Theresia, up there, I really liked how it was set up this year for the first time. And also on the boat, I didn't have a chance to go on the boat, but I've heard it was quite nice. And I even heard that there was a boat booze. It was going back and forth to the Devin Castle. Well, if I knew that, I would go there, but I was not invited. Anyway, the concert, the gala dinner, we had more than 200 bilateral sessions and multilateral sessions on the sidelines, together with closed-door sessions, because we always say that the heart of the conference is in the main panels and what is discussed here, but the soul is in the corridors. And is in the small rooms, is where the business is done, where new ideas and projects happen. So this is very important in this conference as well. Let me thank the several people and give some acknowledgement at the end of this conference because there is a huge team behind this endeavor that is working all the year. And it's not easy to put together this kind of conference. So first of all, let me thank to the board of GLOBSEC, the chairman, Willy Molterer, for his leadership. Willy, thank you very much. But also to board members, Vasil Hudak, Peter Pudil, Ivan Krastev, Gordon Bajnaj, Anita Orban, Michal Krupinsky, for your wisdom and guidance. A very important role was played by Prime Minister Heger and Chancellor Nehammer, who were advocating for other prime ministers to come. And this partnership with Austria was for the first time. But I've seen what Prime Minister Heger, how dedicated he was to make this a success, because he understands that this is also putting the country and the region to the forefront. So I would like to thank for his leadership in this. Also, it would be impossible without the very close cooperation with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the leadership of Ivan Korczok and Alex Schallenberg, but also by a number of people from the ministries that have been cooperating with us as a public-private partnership on this conference, helping us at home, abroad, in embassies, and I think they deserve also a big applause for that. And this would be impossible without the support of all our institutional partners and corporate partners. So let me mention them because they deserve it. Minister of Defense of the Slovak Republic, Minister of Investments and Regional Development of the Slovak Republic, International Visegrad Fund, NATO Public Diplomacy Division, Wilfried Martin Center, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and corporate partners like Google, KNDS, Microsoft, Saab, BMW, ESA, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, MSD, Roche, and many other GLOBSEC members. Thank you for spending money on the right cause. And a big thanks goes to the GLOBSEC team. For those who have, some of us I've seen that didn't sleep in the last 3 days too well. I've seen some of you going sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning and then going to the sessions at 7:30. But the team of GLOBSEC, for them, it was at least a month like this. And sometimes they slept only 3 or 4 hours, and sometimes even less, when I look at Natalia especially. And when I looked at her face yesterday, I've seen that you really deserve a really big sleep, and not only you, but all the GLOBSEC team. So let me recognize them. The core team led by Milan Solar, Kevin Karabin, Natalia Rypáková, Daniel Hošták, Natalia Ronziková, Nadia Jesenská, Alex Paprčková, Adam Horehaj, Barbara Lukáčová, but also the broader teams of production, communication, policy institute, strategic partnership, financial office. I'm not going to name them all, and I'm sorry for it. We'll do it in the after party, but you deserve a big applause. Thank you. So with that, I would like to thank you, because the biggest thanks also goes to all of you. And actually, I have to correct my number from the beginning, because I said that we have, actually it was correct, because I said we had more than 1,200 registered guests. It's more than 1,200, because registered guests we had 1,500 actually. And I said 67 countries, but actually we had 80 countries, which is quite remarkable. So big applause for those who have traveled from different places of the world, from Delhi, from India or America and other parts. So thank you for taking your time, come to our beautiful country. And I hope to see you during our projects and other events that we are doing during the year, not only here in Bratislava, but in many other cities, and at the next year's GLOBSEC. And please look at something that we produced also during this year, which is the Danube Tech Valley initiative, which we will be driving for the upcoming years with the leadership of Chancellor Nehammer and Eduard Heger. So thanks once again, and see you soon on many other platforms. Thank you.